وآله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. باب الصلاة صفة الصلاة. The properties of prayer. Now, in the last class, we talked about the conditions of Salah. And because the conditions, although they don't form the actual part of Salah, they are necessary in order for the Salah to be valid. So we've discussed that in detail. And now today we'll talk about Sifatul Salah, or the properties of components of Salah, what actually builds up a Salah and how the Salah is performed. Right, so he starts off by mentioning the fara'is of Salah, things that are farz in Salah. فرائض الصلاة ستة: التحريمة والقيام والقراءة والركوع والسجود والقعدة الأخيرة مقدار التشهد وما زاد على ذلك فهو سنة. There are 6 obligations of Salah. To list them, that's saying Takbir Tahrima. Number 2, that is Qiyam. Number 3, recitation of the Quran, Al-Qira'ah. Number 4, it's Ruku. Number 5, it's Sujud. And number 6 is Al-Qa'd al-Akhirah, the sitting in the last rak'ah. Right? So let's take each one and talk a bit about it. So the first farz is At-Takbir At-Tahrima. Right? And it's mentioned in the Quran, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, in Surah Al-Mukhtasar, that say the takbir of your Lord. And now we know this is for the sake of Salah, because in a hadith in Tirmizi, it's mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he said about the Salah, تَحْرِيمُهَا التَّكْبِيرُ وَتَحْلِيلُهَا التَّسْلِيمُ, that the start of the Salah is with the takbir by saying Allahu Akbar, and the end of the Salah is by actually saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And other than that, the Prophet Islam always started his Salah by saying Allahu Akbar. So this tahrima is how you begin a Salah. Now, tahrim actually means to make something haram, right? And so a lot of the things that were mubah before the Salah actually started, like talking, eating, drinking, changing your direction, your attention. So all these things were mubah originally. But when you start your Salah and you say Allahu Akbar, you actually make all of these things temporarily haram, because all of these things are forbidden in your Salah. If someone commits these acts, their Salah becomes invalid. So the physical metaphor, when you raise your hands, is the same as if you're throwing all these mubah things behind you, right? Making them haram. So that's the first farz that we have. The second farz we have is qiyam, that is standing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, and then stand for Allah, qanitin, that is silent and in reverence. And the Mufassirin have pretty much made a consensus that this verse has been revealed for the Salah, which means that standing in Salah is an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how much do you need to stand? How long? Enough that you can recite something from the Quran. Like a 2-second qiyam does not constitute as a qiyam, or it's not a qiyam which satisfies the first requirement. It should be long enough for someone to be able to recite at least some part of the Quran, right? And the Prophet Islam, he mentioned, Salli qa'iman, that you should pray while standing. فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَقَائِدًا, and if it's not possible, then pray while sitting down. So originally the hukum is to stand and pray. Now, what is standing? Like, what position will you call that you are standing? If you're a normal person, then standing refers to the fact that if you stretch your hand, they don't reach your knees. right? If they're not reaching your knees, if your hands are not reaching your knees, then that means you're in a standing position, right? And I mentioned you have to be normal because if you have really long hands, then it's pretty much possible you'll be standing straight with a straight back and still your hands might be reaching your knees. That's an exception. Or if someone's a hunchback, right? And then their hands are reaching their knees because of the bend in their body, which is natural. That's also an excuse for them. That won't be the qiyam. But for normal people, in order to decide what qiyam is, so basically you just keep your hands by your sides. And if they reach your knees, and if they don't reach your knees, that means that you are now in a standing position. And it's better to ground yourself when in the state of qiyam, meaning you should firmly place both your feet on the ground. Now you could stand on your toes, you could stand only on one leg. Your prayer would still be valid, but without any udhr, without any excuse, it's makruh to do so. It's best for the khushu, for the concentration, to have yourself fully grounded when you are in the qiyam position. Also, the last thing to remember is that this qiyam, this is a rukun, a component that is farz only in the farz and wajib salawat. As far as sunnah and nafil are concerned, qiyam is not farz, which means you can intentionally, without any udhr, pray your sunnah or nafil prayers while sitting down. Although it's mentioned in the hadith that the ajr that a person gets when reciting the Quran in a standing position is twice than that they get when in a sitting position. Unless, of course, you're unable to stand initially because of some uzr. In that case, even when you are reciting in a sitting position, you still get the full ajr. But for a normal person, recitation in the qiyam is twice as virtuous than recitation in uh, al-qa'da, in the sitting position. But this is only for the salah. Outside of salah, recitation of the Quran has the same virtue either you're standing or you're sitting. The third farz that we have is qira'ah. And this qira'ah is farz without any specifications. It's not specifically that Surah Fatiha is farz or some other surah is farz. If you recite anything from the Quran, your first recitation will be complete. What about Surah Fatiha? It's coming in more detail, but just to summarize, that Fatiha is wajib. If you don't, you'll have to make sajdat al-sahv, but your farz will still be complete if you recite any other part of the Quran. And how much are you supposed to recite? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, فَقْرَوْا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. So recite whatever is easy for you from the Quran. So anything which constitutes as Quran, if a person hears it, understands that it's part of the Quran, that suffices. There's no limit to it. Usually what ulama prescribe is either 3 small verses, 1 long verse, or 1 small surah, the minimum requirement. This is basically just to distinguish the fact that you're reciting the Quran, right? Because if you say it less than this, someone might think that you're saying some Arabic sentence out of the blue. Maybe it's not part of the Quran. So you have to recite enough of it that everybody can be certain that you're actually making recitation and you're not just speaking in Arabic. And then you have the ruku, the bowing position. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Hajj and in 82 other places, irka'u wasjudu, perform ruku and perform sujood. So what is this ruku we're talking about? The minimum of ruku is to bend your back such that if you stretch your hand, it would reach your knees. So quite simply, in the faras, when you stretch your hands, in the qiyam, when you stretch your hands, they don't reach the knees. And in the ruku, when you stretch your hands, they reach the knees. So bending just enough uh, is considered to be ruku, right? That is when you are actually standing before that. If you initially start your prayer while sitting, then the ruku is to bend yourself enough that your forehead is in the same line as your knee. So bend enough that your forehead becomes in the same line as your knee. The fifth wajib that you have is sujood, right? To make the sajda. And the same verse, it asks us to make sajda. And what is sujood? Sujood means waz'u al-jabha al-ard. That is to firmly place your forehead on the ground. So if you don't place your forehead, your sujood won't be complete. Placing your nose is best to join with it. It's not necessary. So placing just your forehead will suffice. But placing just your nose won't do. But it's best to place both your forehead and your nose to make a strong sujood, right? So that's the requirement. So if someone, they place their chin on the ground, or if they place their cheek on the ground, this does not count as performing a sajda. And the last farz within any salah is the final qa'dah. In a 2-unit prayer, it's after the second unit. In a 3-unit prayer, it's after 3, and in a 4-unit prayer, it's after the 4th unit, after the 4 rak'ah. The qa'dah that you do, that sitting position, that is farz, right? So at the time that the Prophet ﷺ, he was teaching Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu at-tashahhud, right? He told him, إِذَا قُلْتَ هَذَا أَوْ فَعَلْتَ هَذَا فَقَدْ تَمَّتْ صَلَاتُكَ. If you say the tashahhud, or at least you just sit down in the position of tashahhud, فَقَدْ تَمَّتْ صَلَاتُكَ, your salah is complete. So we know by this hadith that actually reciting the tashahhud is not farz. Just sitting in that position suffices. Right? Then he says, وَمَا زَادَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ فَهُوَ سُنَّةٌ. Anything beyond these 6 things is sunnah. Now, obviously, a question may come to mind that we've heard about wajibat fi salah. There are things that are wajib. True, there are things that are wajib in salah, but what he means, Imam Quduri means when he says, وَمَا زَادَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ فَهُوَ sunnah, anything beyond this is sunnah, he means that the proof of those actions are from the sunnah. As far as their legal status is concerned, that could range from anything from being wajib, sunnah, to even mustahab or mubah. The whole range of legal status for these different actions is available, but proof of all of these things comes from the sunnah. You might have noticed that I mentioned a verse of the Quran for almost all of the 6 obligations that we just mentioned. As far as the other actions are concerned, you don't find direct verses of the Quran to legitimize those actions. You find them in the hadith. So that's why he's saying, وَمَا زَادَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ فَهُوَ sunnah. Anything beyond this is sunnah. A proof of it is from sunnah. Now he's going to talk about how the prayer is performed, the actual method of performing the prayer, right? Uh, to keep a note in mind that the method that he's mentioning over here is how a man should be praying. right? In the more detailed commentaries, there are some distinctions between the prayer of the man and the woman, right? Now, for first question that might come to mind, and you might have heard some people say that there's no distinction between the prayer of men and women. And for this, they present a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." And they mention a principle that whenever the Prophet, al-ibratu lil ma'ani la lil alfaz, that whenever the Prophet mentions something, its hukum is applied for both men and women. And so when in this hadith he says that pray as you see me praying, then obviously he would have prayed with only one method. He would have prayed once. And then he's instructing all of the Sahaba to pray the same as he is praying, both men and women, right? So by this hadith, one can conclude that there should be no distinction between the salah of men and women. In principle, this is true. When we have a hadith in which the Prophet Islam says something, it's applied to both men and women, but it only happens when you don't find other hadiths suggesting that there might be a distinction. So in the case of a salah, you find other hadith, you find the amal of the sahabiyat radiallahu anhunna, that they were performing prayers in a method that was different than that from their male counterparts, right? So although normally this hukum would apply across the board, but it doesn't over here because you have other hadiths which actually specify that the salah for women is different. And also, if you look at the context of the hadith, Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, you'll find that the Prophet Islam said those words at the time of the year 5th after Hijr, when the Sahaba with the Prophet were busy digging the trench before the army of the Quraysh came to attack Medina. And at the time of digging the trench, women were present. The only audience that was in front of the Prophet Islam were the men. And so this khitab is being delivered to the men. He's actually telling the men, Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. The pray as you see me praying. It's not for the women because they weren't present over there. And for them, we have to look at how the Ummahatul Mu'mineen radiallahu anhunna or other Sahabiyat used to pray. So we'll go over the text, and whenever there's a distinction between the salah of a man and women, I'll mention it to you. وَإِذَا دَخَلَ الرَّجُلُ فِي صَلَاتِهِ, when a man enters his prayer, كَبَّرَ, he says the takbir. وَرَفَعَ يَدَيْهِ مَعَ التَّكْبِيرِ, and he raises both his hands with the takbir, حَتَّى يُحَاذِيَ بِإِبْهَامَيْهِ شَحْمَةَ أُذُنَيْهِ, until his thumbs are parallel to his earlobes. For women, they raise their hands until they reach their shoulders. It should be parallel to the shoulders, right? So takbir literally means to say Allahu Akbar. But what if you say something else which gives the similar meaning, but it's not Allahu Akbar? For example, in qala badalam min takbir, if someone says other than takbir, let's say they say Allahu Ajal, Allahu A'zam, Allahu Ar-Rahman, or Ar-Rahman Akbar, right? Anything denoting the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Any word other than Allahu Akbar, which gives you the same meaning. أجزأه عند أبي حنيفة ومحمد رحمه الله تعالى. According to the Tarafain, all of these words are sufficient. They are all acceptable in the place of Allahu Akbar, in the place of Takbir. While Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah ta'ala says, لا يجوز إلا أن يقول الله أكبر أو الله الأكبر أو الله الكبير أو الله كبير. But Imam Yusuf says that not every word can be used. The hadith mentions وتحريمها التكبير. So it should be التكبير. Should have the root words of kibar in it, kaf, bara. So it can either be Allahu Akbar, Allahu Al Akbar, Allahu Kabir, Allahu Al Kabir. So whether it's Akbar or Kabir, you have the root words of kibar in it. So it forms part of the takbir. So only such words are allowed in which there is the word takbir mentioned. It does not suffice only to declare the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It must be done through the words of takbir, right? And so the fatwa is on Imam Abu Yusuf's opinion that you should say any of the words of takbir, and the best is to say Allahu Akbar, because that is sunnah, that is something that the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba did. So it's best to follow their practice. Now, once you've said your takbir, what do you do next? ويعتمد بيده اليمنى على اليسرى ويضعهما تحت السرة. For the man, he then places his right hand over his left hand and he places both of them beneath the navel. For women, they do the same, except for placing it beneath the navel, they place it on their chest. So you first place the left hand, then the right hand goes on the left hand. And then you say the thana. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك وتبارك اسمك وتعالى جدك ولا إله غيرك. These are the more famous words. There are other siyagh of the thana as well. For example, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك وتبارك اسمك وتعالى جدك وجل ثناؤك. The increment of the word وجل ثناؤك after وتعالى جدك. And that's also proven, but because its proof comes from a relatively Za'if hadith, the ulama suggest that use the thana for the funeral prayers or for the nafil prayers. As far as the farz and wajib prayers are concerned, just stick to this thana in front of you. So subhanaka, glory to be to you, Allahumma, Ya Allah, wa bihamdika, all praise for you, wa tabarak asmuk, blessed is your name, wa ta'ala jadduk, exalted is your dominion, wa la ilaha ghayruk, and there is no God but you. So what do you do after you're done with your thana? وَيَسْتَعِيذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Then you seek refuge with Allah from the shaitan. So you can say أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أو أستعيذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. So anything in which you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a refuge, any seal would do. But again, it's best to stick with أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم because that's how the Prophet ﷺ used to do. ويقرأ بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم, and then you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim وَيُسِرُّ بِهِمَا, and both the ta'awudh and the tasmiyah, both your a'udhu billah and your Bismillah should be done inaudibly. It shouldn't be out loud. Whether you're praying your farz or your nafil prayer, whether you are in a jahri prayer in which you're reciting out loud, or whether you are in a silent prayer in which you don't recite out loud, in any case, your ta'awudh and tasmiyah should be made silently. If someone says it out loud, their prayer doesn't become invalid, but it's better not to do so. Now we know that the tahrima is a farz, starting your prayers, but using the words of Allahu Akbar is a wajib. Right? So tahrima can be done. Starting your prayer could have been made through any action, but because we have a hadith telling us how to do it, it's now wajib to start your prayer with the takbir. What this means that if you start your praying, but let's say you say Alhamdulillah and you start your prayer, right? Or you say Allahu Ajal, for example, and start your prayer. Your prayer has commenced because you made the intention, and so this will count as a tahrima. But because you did not complete the wajib of saying Allahu Akbar, at the end you'll have to make sajdatul sahw. Now let's come to the qira'ah part. We know that mutlaqul qira'ah is farz. You have to make something, recite something from the Quran. What should you be reciting? He mentions ثم يقرأ فاتحة الكتاب وسورة معها أو ثلاث آيات من أي سورة شاء. Then a person should recite Fatiha, which is a wajib in the prayer, and should recite any chapter or three verses from any chapter that a person wants. This is the second wajib. So just to make recitation is farz, but that farz has two parts that you need to complete. You have to recite the Fatiha first, and then you have to join it with some other surah of the Quran, or at least three verses, or one long verse from the Quran. That's the second wajib. If you recite any of these things, your farz will be complete, but you'll have to make sahv at the end. And the tartib is also necessary, the order. First comes the Fatiha and then comes the other surah. If you change the order, you first recite some other surah and then recite the Fatiha, you're missing out on a wajib, which means that at the end of the salah, you'll have to make sahab again, right? So these things or these wajibat must be taken care of when you are performing the faraz of the qira'ah. وإذا قال الإمام ولا الضالين قال الآمين. That the person behind them is going to say Ameen. Oh, sorry. The Imam is also going to say Ameen. The person behind him is also going to say Ameen. ويقولها المؤتم ويخفيها. And the person behind the Imam, you know, he's also going to say Ameen ويخفيها, but they're going to say it inaudibly. You might have observed the Arab people actually saying Ameen out loud. The Salafis saying it out loud. Both of them are acceptable. You can say it inaudibly and you can say it out loud as well. Both of them are from the Sunnah. What you need to realize is that if you're in a place or you're in a masjid where people are accustomed to only one method, maybe you're in a place where everyone just does ikhfa, no one raises their voice. And although the second is sunnah, saying it out loud is also proven by sunnah, you should not be doing it. Why? Not because it's a sin, but because a lot of common people, they're unaware of the fact that both of them are sunnah, right? And what this could happen is this might lead to a fitna of sorts, of fighting between the Musallin, because if you say it out loud, and they have this rasikh belief that only saying out loud is not allowed, right? And this can result in fighting between the Musallin, could result in some upheaval or uproar, and or avoid this fitna. If you're in a place where people are accustomed to one method, use that method. But if they're conditioned to diversity, they're seeing everything happening all the time, someone raising the voice, someone not raising it, right? Then there's no problem in also raising your voice if you wish to. But again, this is for men. As for women are concerned, everybody says that they have to lower their voice, unless you're in a very exclusive women-only jama'ah. Although it's still better that you don't raise your voice, but even if you do, it won't invalidate your salah. Now, this is one of those places where there's a lot of ikhtilaf one might come across in the commentaries of hadith and the books of fiqh, that whether or not Amin is to be said aloud or is to be said silently, right? And like I mentioned, you have hadith for both of the things. right? The best one could say is that one method is preferred over the other. That's the best one could say. But the reality is, when you have hadith on both sides, one should refrain from making such judgments, right? Who are we to judge which is more afdal, which is more better, to say it out loud or to keep it silently, when we have hadith on both sides? So in such matters, it's better to just keep silent, keep doing what you've been doing. But the only thing that you need to keep in mind, like I mentioned, is to see that your actions don't cause some sort of fitna, some sort of uproar or fighting between the Muslims. So you're done with Surah Al-Fatiha. You say Ameen, you're done with the other surah with it. What do you do next? ثم يكبر ويركع. Then he says takbir and then performs the ruku. Now remember, only the takbir tahrima, the first takbir through which you began your salah, is farz. All other takbir that come after it are just sunnah. So even if you don't say anything and just go directly into the ruku, salah is still valid. ويركع. And how do you do the ruku? ويعتمد بيديه على ركبتيه. The man rests his hands on his knees, opens his fingers wide, levels his back, يفرج أصابعه ويبسط ظهره. ولا يرفع رأسه, and he doesn't raise his head, ولا ينقصه, and doesn't bow it down as so that the chin starts touching the chest. But as for women are concerned, they do the bare minimum of ruku, which we previously mentioned, that it's you just go down enough that your hands reach your knees. That's it. They don't have to flatten their backs. And when they're doing ruku, they're not going to open their fingers, they're going to keep their fingers closed. Men would be holding their knees, but women will just be placing their hands on their knees. No need to grab the knees. So that's why you don't need to open your fingers, you keep them closed. And you just place them on your knees with just the minimum bend in the back. This is how she should do. But if she accidentally or on purpose makes the ruku that a man is supposed to make, although it's not liked, but it does not invalidate the salah. What do you say in the ruku? Subhana Rabbil Azim, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times. So the minimum 3 times. Then in odd numbers, either 5, 7, 9, 11, however far you want to go. But doing it odd numbers is sunnah. And saying Subhana Rabbil Azim itself is sunnah. If you don't say anything, your salah is still acceptable. In the books of Adiyah, there are other dua or other adhkar also mentioned for a person to say when they're in the ruku or when they're in the sujood, right? And if they have proof from sunnah, then obviously there's no harm in actually using those adhkar as well. But what the ulama suggest is that in farz prayer, just stick to Subhana Rabbil Azim in ruku and Subhana Rabbil A'la in sujood. And use those other adhkar in your sunnah and your nafil prayers. For the farz and wajib, just stick to Subhana Rabbil Azim and Subhana Rabbil A'la, right? And so 3, that should be the minimum. And then when you're done, ثم يرفع رأسه, you should raise your head and stand uh, still and completely stand uh, straight, right? You shouldn't have a bend in your body when you're coming up from the ruku. And then you're going to say, Sami Allahu liman hamida. And the person praying behind you, if you're the imam, will say, Rabbana lakal hamd. And if you're praying individually, then you combine both of these words. Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana lakal hamd. And again, there are other words, other adhkar also mentioned at this time. For example, ربنا لك الحمد حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه, and other adhkar like that. That in your first prayer or your wajib prayer, just stick to saying Alhamdulillah, and all of these other adhkar can be recited in your nafil or sunnah prayer. And if you want to look at where all these adhkar are mentioned, these different adhkar for the ruku, the sujood, in between ruku and sujood, right? The jalsa, the qiyam. There's a book called Hisnul Hasin by Imam Muhammad al-Jazari. It has an English translation by the name of The Fortified Fortress. And so all of these different adhkar and adhiya are actually mentioned in that book. So you can refer to that to know. And it's a good thing to actually increase and change your adhiya and adhkar during your prayer, because this helps in creating mindfulness and awareness of praying. You don't just go on autopilot by repeating the same things over and over again, right? So changing it up actually helps the focus in your prayer. So you're done the ruku, you come back up. فإذا استوى قائما. So when you're upright in the standing posture, right? Bara wa sajada. You say takbir again and then go for the sajda, then prostrate. How do you do that? For the man, it says, وَاعْتَمَدَ بِيَدَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ. He's going to rest his hands on the ground. وَوَزَعَ وَجْهَهُ بَيْنَ كَفَّيْهِ. And he's going to place his face between both his hands. وَسَجَدَ عَلَى أَنْفِهِ وَجَبْهَتِهِ. And you're going to make the sajda on both your forehead and on your nose. فَإِنِ اقْتَصَرَ عَلَى أَحَدِهِمَا. And if someone makes the sajda on one of these two things, either the nose or either the forehead, جَازَ عِنْدَ أبي حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى. Imam Abu Hanifa says that the prayer is acceptable, even if it's only one of those two. وقال, the Sahibain say, لا يجوز الاقتصار على الألف إلا من عذر. You cannot just suffice on the nose when making the sajda. You must place your your forehead as well. إلا من عذر. Although if there is some valid excuse, then that's another thing. But normally you're going to have to place your forehead on the ground in order for sajda to be complete. Right? Now, this position that he's mentioning, he's not differentiating between men and women. Both of them are going to place their hands on their ground and going to place their face between the ground. There will be some differences in the position which he's going to mention later on. فإن سجد على قور عمامته أو على فاضل ثوبه جاز. So if someone prostrates on a fold of their turban or their scarf, or on some extra portion or clothing on the ground, it's still permitted. You don't directly have to touch the floor with your forehead, right? As long as you can feel the pressure of the ground against your forehead, it doesn't matter if there's a layer of carpet, a piece of cloth in between, the sajda is still valid. But if you have something so fluffy, a pillow, for example, in which you're unable to feel the hardness of the ground against your forehead, in that case, the sajda won't be complete, right? So something coming in between you and the ground, it's not much of a problem, unless it actually prevents you from being able to feel the hardness of the ground. What else do you do in the sajda? For the man, what he does is yubdi zabaihi. He opens up his armpits, right? Exposes them as much as he can. وَيُجَافِي بَطْنَهُ عَنْ فَخِذَيْهِ. And he separates his stomach from his thighs. So when making the sajda, he should stretch far enough that his stomach should not be touching his thighs, right? وَيُوَجِّهِ أَصَابِعَهُ أصابع رجليه نحو القبلة, and his toes should be bent and pointing towards the Qibla. But for women, they won't do any of these things. They're not going to open up their armpits. Rather, they're going to close them, join with their sides, and actually place the entire arm on the ground. They won't lift it off the ground. The entire arm up to the elbows, they'll be placing it on the ground. They won't separate their stomach from the thighs, but try to join it as much as they can. They're going to stick their stomach to their thighs. So scrolling up as much as they can. That's basically the idea of what they're supposed to do, right? And they won't have their toes pointing towards the Qibla. I mean, they won't erect their feet on the ground, but actually lay them towards the side, towards the right side. Both of the feet will go towards the right side of their body. So they have to make themselves as concise as they can, right? Because هذا أستر لهن. This is best in order to hide their aura, right? You don't want their whole bodies to be exposed, their figure to be exposed. So that's why they're going to perform the sujood, as we've mentioned. And what are they going to say? 3 times the minimum, or increase it in odd numbers. Subhana Rabbil A'la. Those other adhkar and ad'iyah for the sujood, you can look them up in Hisn al-Hasin and use them in your nafil and sunnah prayers. So you made the first sajda, then what do you do? ثم يرفع رأسه ويكبر. Then you raise your head while saying the takbir. وإذا اطمأن جالسا. And once you've settled down in the sitting posture, and all your joints go back to their resting place, كبر وسجد. You again say the takbir and then perform the second sajda, right? Same 3 times, say Subhana Rabbil A'la. Any other dua or dhikr that you know of, you do that. And what do you do? فَإِذَا اطْمَأَنَّ سَاجِدًا. And once you've settled down in your second sujood, you went in the sajda, all your limbs go back into rest. كَبَّرَ وَاسْتَوَى قَائِمًا عَلَى صُدُورِ قَدَمَيْهِ. You're going to again say takbir, and then you're going to stand up directly on the balls of your feet, right? You're not going to sit down and then stand up. When you're done with the second sajda, you're not going to just sit down for a few seconds and then stand up. You're going to directly stand up, right? وَلَا يَعْتَمِدُ بِيَدَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ. For the man, he does not support himself with his hands on the ground. But the women are going to need to support themselves by placing their hands on the ground to lift themselves up, because their sitting position, their sitting posture is different from that of the men. So for the men, it's recommended that they directly stand up without taking the support of the ground, while the women can take the support of the ground. And this is again when you're young and you're healthy. If you're old or if you're overweight and you simply can't find yourself to do this without actually taking the support, it's okay to take the support, right? So it's only mustahab to stand up directly. And with that, you've now completed your first rak'ah, your first unit. Now let's talk about the second unit. So وَيَفْعَلُ فِي الرَّكْعَةِ الثَّانِيَةِ مِثْلَ مَا فَعَلَ فِي الْأُولَى. You do exactly the same thing that you did in the first unit. إلا أنه لا يستفتح ولا يتعوذ ولا يرفع يديه إلا في تكبيرة الأولى. Except for 3 things that you don't have to do this time in the second unit. That is, you are not going to say the thana, Subhanak Allahumma. You're not going to say A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem. And you're not going to raise your hands like you did in Takbiratul Ula when you said Allahu Akbar the first time. Except for these 3 things, your entire process of the second unit will be the same as that of the first unit. Now you've done with the second sajda of the second unit. What do you do next? فإذا رفع رأسه من السجدة الثانية في الركعة الثانية. When you raise your head from the second sajda of the second rak'ah, افترش رجله اليسرى. For the man, he spreads his left leg on the ground and sits on it. ونصب اليمنى نصبة, and erects his right foot firmly on the ground. ووجه أصابعه نحو القبلة, with his toes pointing of the right feet, pointing towards the qibla. For women, they're going to sit with both of their feet towards the either side, either the left side or the right side. You can do both, right? And this position is known as tawarruk. So you're probably aware of how that is performed. And they're not going to erect their feet in order to point the toes toward Qibla. It'll be on their sides. وَوَضَعَ يَدَيْهِ عَلَى فَخِذَيْهِ, and place their hands on their laps, their thighs. وَبَسَطَ أَصَابِعَهُ, and they're going to spread their fingers, right? You can spread your fingers a little, not excessively, not a lot. Just keep them in the normal position, right? That much suffices. And then just place them on the thighs. And then they're going to recite the tashahhud, right? And you're going to say the tashahhud. What is the tashahhud? That is when a person says at-tahiyyatu lillah was-salawatu wat-tayyibat. Assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabi wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alayna wa ala ibadillah salihin. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. And this is known as Tashahhud ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, because this was the tashahhud that the Prophet ﷺ taught Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. There's also a tashahhud of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhumma, and that goes something like this. التحيات المباركات الصلوات الطيبات لله سلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته سلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. Right? So this is another form of tashahhud. There's also another form of tashahhud by the name of tashahhud Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma. So any of these tashahhud, you can recite any of these tashahhud. The wajib of the tashahhud will be met by doing so, right? All comes down to preference, which one is better. But like I mentioned, when you have hadith on all sides, there's no point in going into the discussion of which is better or which is not. So you can do any of the tashahhud. And again, in order to increase a person's own concentration, you might want to actually change the tashahhud from salah to salah in order to keep them more focused, right? So you can learn all of them if you want, or you can stick to the one that you already know. وَلَا يَزِيدُ عَلَى هَذَا فِي الْقَعْدَةِ الْأُولَى. And this is the last thing. So in the first qa'dah, if you're praying a 4-unit prayer or a 3-unit prayer, right? This will be the first qa'dah. And in 2-unit prayer, this would have been the second or the last qa'dah itself, right? So if it is a 4 or 3-unit prayer, this will be the first qa'dah, and you're only going to recite the tashahhud. You won't go ahead to recite the salawat nor the adiyah afterwards. And what you do after that is you actually stand up for the last 2 units. And remember, the last 2 units will be the same as the first 2 units in everything except for the 3 exceptions in the second unit, and for the fact that in the last 2 units, last 2 rak'ah, you recite only Surah Al-Fatiha. You don't recite any other surah. You can also choose not to recite Surah Al-Fatiha at all and just recite some other adhkar, say Subhanallah 3 times, for example. And you also have the option of keeping silent as well. So the last two units, ويقرأ في ركعتين الأخرين بفاتحة الكتاب خاصة, you only recite the Surah Al-Fatiha, and that's it. Uh, then after that, you're done with the last two units, you sit for the last qada. فإذا جلس في آخر الصلاة, when a person sits at the end of their prayer, جلس كما جلس في الأولى, they sit as they sat in the first time. وتشهد, and they're going to say the tashahud like we discussed. وصلى على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, then they're going to send blessings upon the Prophet ﷺ, whether it's the Durud Ibrahim, the whole Durud that we recite, or whether some other short sigh of the Durud like sallallahu alaihi wasallam or jazallahu anna Muhammadan ma huwa ahluhu, or any other Durud Sharif, right? Durud, it suffices. Saying the Durud Ibrahimi, the long one that we're accustomed to, that's all in well, best. But if you want to suffice with some other form of durud, that is also acceptable. And remember, saying the tashahud is wajib, saying the durud is sunnah. So if someone misses it out, their salah is valid and they don't have to make the sahaf for it. What do you do after you're done with durud? دعا بما شاء بما يشبه ألفاظ القرآن والأدعية المأثورة. Then you make supplication with whatever you want from the words of the Quran. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. From the hadith, اللهم إني أعوذ بك من قلب لا يخشى, من نفس لا تشبع, من دعوة لا يستجاب لها. Or anything which matches the words of the Quran hadith, your own words in Arabic, which match the words of Quran hadith, not more words, basically the mafahim and the meanings and the message, or they resemble the adiyah mentioned in the Quran and Hadith, right? That's what you should be reciting. وَلَا يَدُعُ بِمَا يُشْبِهُ كَلَامَ النَّاسِ, and should not supplicate things that resemble speech of humans. Easy distinction. Anything you can ask a human being, don't make dua for that in your salah. Anything you can't ask a human being, make such dua in your salah. So, for example, asking for maghfirah, asking for jannah, asking from protection from the shaitan, from protection from nar, asking the riza of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all these things, you can't ask a human being. They can't grant you these things. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can. So these are the things that you should be asking. Best to stick with the adiyah from the Quran and the hadith, and don't even use your own words, especially in the farz and wajib salah. But if you choose to do so, and their mafahim and their meanings, their message resonates with that of the hadith and the Quran, your salah is valid, it's completely acceptable. But again, ulama suggest that in your farz and wajib salah, stick to only those dua that are mentioned in the Quran and hadith. Don't use your own words. Keep that for your sunnah and nafil prayer. So make as much as dua as you want. ثم يسلم عن يمينه. Then you say the salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Turn your face towards the right. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Turn your face towards the left. When you turn your face towards the right, make the intention of saying the salam to the angels on your right shoulder. And if you're in a congregation, make the intention of saying salam to those people praying beside you, both on the right side and on the left side. And if you're the imam, you make the intention of your muqtadeen as well, that those muqtadeen beside on my right side and those on my left side, right? And also in both cases for those right behind me as well. So that's how you say the salam with this intention. So when you make this and ending your prayer with assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, it's a wajib itself, right? You have to do. But if you make the intention of saying salam to everybody who's to your right and everybody who's to your left, you'll get extra ajr for saying salam to each and every single person who will be on either sides. So to increase your ajr, make that intention as well. And if you don't, your prayer will still be completely valid.